Well, welcome everybody. Today we're going to get started with our How to Build Inclusive Data Experiences event. Our feature today is Frank Elavsky. We'll have him going on in about a half an hour or so. In the short term, we wanted to just kind of set the stage for the event. Isabella, if you can go to the next slide. One of the oh, I see what happens. I get the delay. All right. Okay. So since we are doing building an inclusive, talking about an inclusive event, first thing y'all need to be aware of is there is a code of conduct. This is a Project Jupyter event, which means that we're abiding the Project Jupyter code of conduct. If you have any questions or anything that you need to report, you can click on this link and follow any instructions. If you need to contact any of the event organizers, Isabella, myself, and Tanya are all here to support you. So please use the chat and let us know if there's anything you need. Be reminded, this event is recorded and posted publicly. So between discussions and chats and stuff like that, all of this is public. So, be mindful. Yeah, that's all the business kind of stuff that we need. So what happens next in this? I think we talked about Jupyter.
Yeah.
Welcome to Jupyter. Oh my God. Everybody
now you've
is
changed
a Jovian
planet.
Yes, you are new people. This is new life. Yeah, so this event is sponsored by Project Jupyter, which is an all-in-one data science, data analysis solution. We do a lot of data visualization. You're going to hear a lot of terms during the course of this event that probably revolve around Jupyter. You'll hear about Jupyter Notebooks. You'll hear about Jupyter Hub. You'll hear about Jupyter Lab. If you're unfamiliar with Jupyter, please ask questions in the chat. While this is going on, I think it would be good to take a little poll about how familiar folks are with Jupyter, so we can kind of get a feel for that. Yeah, welcome to possibly your first Jupyter event or your 10th, 100th Jupyter event. But we're happy to have you here. Want to go next? Parts of this slide didn't load.
Nice. Yeah, I've never gotten that before. Perfect, super right?
Cool. Yeah, right. So Jupyter is more than a single project file type interface. It probably is a community at its extent, but Jupyter has a lot of things going on. There are a lot of tools that enable data ingest, data visualization, data analysis. So this talk that we're having today is really important, and recording it will be super valuable to the community at large. So again, if anybody is not familiar with Jupyter, please let's use the chat. We've got a bunch of Jupyter experts here. They can help answer your questions. We're kind of going to have an intersection of Jupyter experts and accessibility experts and design experts here. So let's try and make the best of all of these different people meeting together. I think my only job was to talk about Jupyter, but it's really important to recognize that Jupyter does have tons of data visualization libraries, and it will be fabulous for us in this room and those that hear this talk to figure out how to apply Frank's principles and the things that he talks about to our open source tools so that we are building a more inclusive experience. Why don't we keep on cruising? And I think it's time for Isabella to tell us a little bit about accessibility.
Yes, it is. And real quick, hello, I am Isabella Percedo Floyd. I am a Latina woman with short curly black hair, and I'm just wearing a cool black and white blazer today. Who you heard talking was Tony, and that is, I don't know how Tony wants to describe himself, but my partner in crime in Jupyter for sure. So I'm just going to be giving an overview because I don't know exactly what Frank has to give to us today in terms of like explaining accessibility or anything else, but just making sure we're all kind of starting on an even foundation, whether you decide to join this event because you're like, wow, accessibility, I already do a ton of that and I want to learn more, or whether you're like, oh, I've never heard of this, I'm just really curious about what it is. So accessibility, as we're going to be using it today, is a term to describe designing, building, and just creating things that can be used by as many people as possible. But specifically, we're focused on making sure that disabled people can use it, right? These are people that we leave out a lot in these processes and in the things that we create. And disabled, a lot of times people will focus on blind and visually impaired exclusively. So I also want to say That's not the limit here at all. Could be motor disabilities, could be cognitive, could even be temporary. There are all kinds of situations where things may be changing. What we're going to be talking today, though, more because Jupyter is a web app, is digital and web accessibility. So you'll probably also hear the words WCAG at some point, or WCAG, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, because those are the major guidelines used for this type of content. And other than that, I think we're good to go. Are you seeing anything in the chat, Tony, that I should be addressing? Are we getting a lot of people saying that they are new to this, not anything like that?
Doesn't seem like there's any questions, but if anybody has any, please feel free to throw them out. I can't find the poll. Did we put out a poll? There is a poll. Oh, how do we show the results? I click on show results. There we go. We've only gotten one vote, so only one person here heard of Jupyter.
Well, thank you.
For those of y'all that are in Hopin, right next to the chat, there is a little tab for polls. We'd love if y'all could let us know some of your experience with Jupyter, so we can gauge this a little bit better.
Yeah, and we're exploring this whole interface too, so thank you for going along on that ride with us. And I'll probably ask you a few more times since I can't see it while I'm screen sharing, Tony. But yeah, that's my quick overview of accessibility. One of the other things I want to say, though, accessibility is not new, right? I've personally seen an uptick in interest in it recently, which is awesome. I love to see that. But I think it's important to remember that this isn't something that just appeared or that people haven't been working on or that hasn't been a problem for a long time. So just to point out a few instances that might be familiar, I am in the US, so I was looking. Curb cuts, meaning the kind of ramps in sidewalk curbs, which was initially for wheelchair access, have been happening in the US since about the 1940s, even though they were not required at that time. National legislation starts to become a little more common globally, so multiple countries between like the 1990s to the 2000s. And we've had some version of web accessibility guides since 1995. So these aren't things that have come up overnight, and there's a lot that we can learn from our past. However, this is kind of new to Jupyter. There have been people talking about accessibility for several years, but it's been really a challenge to get a concerted effort, as it is with anything open source, right? There's a lot of back and forth there, working on volunteered time. So it makes sense, but we're really trying to ramp that up, and we have a lot to learn here. So that's part of why we're doing these events. Accessibility is also cross-project in Jupyter. I spend a lot of time in certain projects, so I wanted to make it clear, this touches all kinds of things. One of the things I mean by this is that, right, it's not just about the notebook file or the interface or the documentation or the organization website or any of that, right? It's actually all of it at once. And so it's not just one project's problem or one person's problem or even one team's problem. These are cases where we need to collaborate and do what we can to do solutions that can help each other and that can carry over, right? Like if we can do something that solves it for multiple projects at once, that'd be awesome. One example of this, in case you're new to Jupyter, I'm going to explain this kind of interconnectedness in Jupyter Lab because that's where I spend a lot of my time. So say we're starting with the notebook file, which is a totally separate thing used by a lot of different interfaces. And if you add Lumino, a different Jupyter project, and a bunch of other things, you can end up with Jupyter Lab, an interface for the notebook. You also have the documentation with this, right? So we've already talked about like 3 different Jupyter projects. And on top of that, we have RetroLab, which takes Jupyter Lab components, pulls it apart a little, and uses kind of the most, what do I want to say, like the most foundational ones. And so we have kind of this stripped down version. Now we're at 4 projects. And of course, someone could actually ignore Jupyter Lab entirely and just be working with a notebook in so many more notebook interfaces. And then we have a whole bunch of others. So that is just one small section of the ecosystem to give you an example of how this works and why we are looking for accessibility solutions that can cover kind of all of these pieces, all of these Lego blocks, as I'm showing here to try and give that idea. Legos will never stop being a good metaphor. It's kind of amazing. Accessibility is also happening now, right? This is not something that we just want to talk about. We are making some progress. Some highlights from the past year, because we've had really awesome community members. We've had regular meetings for a year, which has just been great for keeping touch, for helping one another, like people saying, I need to know this, I need to know this. We've also had community growth. Like we've had a lot more people show up to these meetings, a lot more people bringing ideas. Some people I've never met in Jupyter before even. We also had WCAG-based audits of multiple projects with related issues and PRs on GitHub so that we can track the problems, and we can also track what's work has been done to fix them. And we have CZI's Essential Open Source Software for Science grant. We have one for Jupyter Accessibility at the moment, which is awesome because that funding allows us to pay people to work on this as their job and not just rely on volunteers. We have had some really amazing volunteers, and I'm super grateful. But this is a big project, so it's wonderful to have a little bit more going on there. I think that's, oh no, I have future goals. So some other things we're working on that haven't been touched on yet. Automated tests, big thing in open source projects for sure, and we really need them with Jupyter to avoid our work being undone. We need to make sure the notebook file format is accessible as can be, as I kind of showed with those Legos, right? That's the foundation of so many different projects and even things outside of Project Jupyter. And we need to update and improve the documentation, both making the content more accessible and the format that it's coming in. Of course, we also want to get you more involved, but we'll get more on that later. There's tons of opportunity if you end up enjoying today's event. And yes, that's what I have to say for now. Thank you for that overview. I will be able to stop sharing my screen and be in chat now. So if you have any questions, I'll do my best to answer them. And I am here to pass it over to Frank Elavsky, a man who Tanya is going to introduce. Yes?
Well, let's just take a quick delay real quick, but there are a bunch of people, pretty much everybody here started Jupyter. So we're good on that. I think we're gonna have another poll coming out just to find out how people are feeling about accessibility, the two things that we're putting together here. So be on the lookout in the chat for that poll. And thank you all for the introduction. And then I'm gonna send it back over to Tanya.
Hi, y'all. I am Tanya. My pronouns are she, her, and I am a Latina woman with short purple hair, and I'm wearing a black t-shirt, purple headphones, and black glasses. It's an honor to introduce our next speaker, Frank. I am so excited about his presentation. Frank, for those of you that don't know him, is a software engineer turned researcher, and he's currently pursuing a PhD at the intersection of accessibility and information-rich systems in Carnegie Mellon. He's also the author of an amazing tool or library called Chartability, which helps us to build more accessible data experiences, graphics, and such. And he'll be talking more about all of his fabulous work in research. And I think this is the perfect timing to bring Frank onto the stage.
Hey, everybody. My name is Frank, pronouns he, him. I am a masculine white man with my hair pulled back in a bun, and I'm wearing a gray turtleneck. I'm also in a weirdly lit room, so I'm doing my best with lighting situation here. I had to move here because the neighbors on the other side of the house are doing construction, so this is the quietest room. Yeah, super glad to be here. I just want to, before I begin, give a massive shout out to the folks who have already spoken and the folks who have already done work in order to just make this happen. Isabella reached out to me months ago and said, hey, would you like to speak? And as I've been preparing materials, I went and dug. I wanted to know, what is Jupyter actually up to? What's this community doing? And I was honestly surprised. Lots of advocacy work. That's exhausting work, really. And lots of trying to get organized. I noticed there's even an audit that it's at least a link I think a student did, and I kind of combed through that and really impressed. I think there's also a lot of accessibility that already has work that already has been done, at least from me poking under the hood and digging around in some notebooks. But at the same time, I think there's a lot of opportunities. And so today I'm going to be talking about things that advice. So my own experiences working in open source communities, working with accessibility, and also specifically dealing with the complexities that what I'm calling our data experiences, the complexities that data experiences offer and the challenges making these things accessible. So yeah, I think that that's sort of the intro that I wanted to give. Thanks again for setting me up and for bringing me here. I'm really excited.
Okay, fabulous. So we're going to leave the stage for Frank, and he's going to be taking questions at the end of the presentation. So if you have any questions, feel free to type them on the stage chat, and we'll pass them over to Frank. So we'll see you a little bit.
Great. Let me get my screen up. And I'm going to make sure I share my system audio. Okay. Looks like we're live. So, I just sent a message. Thank you so much. All right. What do I do? I've kind of been introed already, but I'll just talk about, I think these parts of my background are relevant for today. I'm currently actually researching what I'm calling data interaction or accessibility in information-rich systems. I go back and forth in exactly how I want to talk about it. The work that I do, I want to encompass the actual, I want to address what I largely refer to as communities who do data work, and I want to make that work more accessible. So not just for people who are an audience member or a user of a chart or graph or interactive data system, but also I want to make the work that people do more accessible as well. So that's my research focus. In the past, and I currently organize a group called DataViz Ally. We're a group of people who do accessibility work specifically for data visualization. We're all volunteers. We've been meeting for 2-something years. We do little projects together on the side. Lots of advocacy work. We partner with the Data Visualization Society, if anybody's familiar with them. It's a really big org that's like a collection of like 20,000 practitioners across the world. I also do industry consultations. So between just these things, my hands are full often. My industry consultations include like auditing, engineering, and all kinds of stuff for big companies out there. Sometimes it's volunteer work, but most of the time it's not. And previously I was a staff engineer on Visa's data experience team. And on the right, we see a bar chart. And this is an example chart component that we made. And we did design systems work. So if any of you are familiar with what that kind of work entails, that's what we did. Yeah, I was the lead on the accessibility efforts there, as well as one of the main engineers on the project for all kinds of other stuff too. And of course, as already mentioned, I authored Chartability. So in my own work in the data experience space, I recognized that there were a lot of things that were unaddressed or ambiguous in web standards, which isn't the fault of web standards, right? It's just a recognition that the work of accessibility is always ongoing and changes often depending on our context and the way we use technology. And in the space of charts and graphs, we needed a new set of heuristics for testing accessibility. And so I looked at research, I looked at standards, and I looked at communities of practice to see what are people already doing and already have opinions on, and what are some needs out there. And then I collected all of this into a set of tests. It's kind of an auditing system. So we'll talk more about that later. But that's me. So yeah, my passion is obviously specifically not just like making data work accessible, but it's like charts and graphs and data visualizations are what we generally refer to them as. On the screen here, I've demonstrated on the left, we have a bar chart that kind of scales with negative bars up to positive bars, and it ranges in color from red on the left, and it slowly becomes yellow, then a light blue, and then to a dark blue. And with the scaling color, we also have textures, lines on these bars that are changing in angle and thickness to redundantly encode the color scale. That's a technique for low vision. And then on the right, there's a really interesting screenshot. This is from an audit of like a red arrow pointing into a pie chart that is labeled Google and the rest of ed tech, and then a big screenshot that is a contrast checker noting that the pie chart has a contrast failure inside of it. So yeah, before we start, this may be accessibility, and especially attending an accessibility talk may be new to some of you. And I just want to strongly stress, please share screenshots of this talk and get conversation going. But when you do, if you share screenshots, make sure you add alt text. Very important. I think almost every time I've given a talk, there's been one person who has tagged me in a post without alt text. Please don't be shy. I don't want to discourage you from sharing. I really hope that you do. In fact, you all can just get started screenshotting right now. Already defined or already kind of unpacked a little bit is like, what is accessibility? And I kind of want to talk really briefly about two ways we use the word accessibility or accessible or access. And I also want to note that if you ever see A11Y, sometimes pronounced ally, 11D, which is like a nightmare pronunciation, that abbreviation represents accessibility, because accessibility as a word has the letter A, 11 letters, and the letter Y. I don't know why we chose this as a community, but that little abbreviation is how we also refer to it. So there's two definitions, working definitions, that are important to talk about. There's one, which is the broad definition of accessibility, where we say, it's about the qualities that make an experience open or usable to all people. And that's like general access, right? So we have technological access issues, like there are access justice issues for people who don't have a fast bandwidth internet connection or any internet at all. That's an access justice issue. But we also have accessibility issues specific to people with disabilities. And we're going to be working mostly in that second definition, which is we're defining it as the knowledge and skills to break down barriers specifically for people with disabilities. So I want to say that this is maybe my favorite graphic that I throw all around all the time, because it does one thing that is powerful when you're communicating disability, which is we're gonna kind of expand people's paradigm of how we think about what disability is. I've got a graphic here, and it's kind of represented like a table. It has columns and rows, and on each row is a functional type of disability. So they're labeled touch, see, hear, and speak. And then the columns are actually temporal dimensions of disability. So how disability affects different people depending on time. So some people have a permanent disability, and for example, on the touch column, that's somebody who just only has one arm. Some people have a temporary disability, and so then there's a person who just has an arm injury. That means their arm hopefully will heal, and then they will have access to their second arm. And then there's situational considerations. And in the final column for touch, you might have like a parent holding a child. When we think of something like curb cuts, which we've already talked about, in a curb cut, we're designing for originally advocacy was done on behalf and with and by people who use wheelchairs. But it turns out that cutting curbs and building ramps helps people with temporary and situational limitations as well. So there's kind of this way that I want to frame disability, where we think about the challenges that people with disabilities face as things that we could also face, and maybe also often face. So the way that I phrase this is, I don't want to say that we are disabled constantly by environmental variables. We can be, but the right way to talk about this is we've all already experienced a disabling limitation at some point in our lives, even if it's just temporarily or situationally. And that means that accessibility, the work of making things accessible, is personal to all of us. Absolutely, number one most important thing to consider for data visualization is that virtually everybody we have a very, very high rate of losing our visual acuity as we age. And this is just part of aging. Everyone will face this, and it is massively important for the field of data visualization. So we're not just considering, oh, we're helping other people who are low vision. No, it's very likely going to be us when we age. We're going to need access. So I see some great things in the chat. I may have suffered temporary or situational this morning. Yeah, one of the things for me, it's if I have to like kind of pitch to somebody really quickly, I show them I'm like, oh, I had this really great thing I want to show you on my phone. And I try and do this outside or in a bright location. And I give them my phone, and my contrast is intentionally as low as possible. And they're like, I can't, what? What are you trying to show me? And I'm like, oh, sorry. And I turn the contrast up, and then they can see. And it's just a way to frame the fact that our environment participates in disability, right? And this is why it's important to think about the environments we build as participating in disabling experiences and limitations for other people. Are we building an environment that is potentially causing some limitation for someone else's access? That's really, really, really important. Also, can someone, I think we started a little at off time. Can somebody tell me what time will the 30-minute mark be from the start of my talk? Just drop it in private chat or the comments. Sorry about the interruption. Like, are we running until 30 after right now? Is that when I'm supposed to be totally done? I want to make sure we have time for questions. I actually have questions for the community. And then I hope to also receive questions. I think that's good. Okay, so great. I'll keep rolling. Sorry. So in tension with everything I just said, right? Keeping in mind that we can be experience like disabling limitations or temporary limitations, I just want to say that the specific barriers that people who live with disabilities or have permanent disabilities, the barriers that they face can't be substituted by our experiences. So just because we can put on a blindfold and pretend to be blind, that absolutely does not mean that our experience of simulating or experiencing temporary disabling limitations is in any way the same as the experiences that actual people with disabilities face. So something that I like to do is just kind of frame the relevance from a data perspective, especially when I talk to data people, they love numbers. So we're just going to go through some numbers. The World Health Organization recognizes that, globally vision is a significant global health issue. Uncorrected or uncorrectable moderate to severe visual impairment, which we kind of loosely refer to as low vision, depending on who defines it, affects nearly 30% of people globally. A lot of that is preventable by healthcare. But what we're looking at today is just from a pure numbers perspective. Low vision considerations for accessibility are one of the most important things we can do to improve global access to our interactive systems. And the graphic that I'm showing here is just an example of a set of bars that are very low contrast on the left, using light gray on top of other light grays. The text is light gray on black or on white. And then to the right is just a use of much darker gray for the text and then a dark gray on white instead of light gray on light gray. So improving the way we design color and contrast is hugely important, plus other techniques for low vision. Motor impairment and functional disability, this is big. So just in the United States alone, motor impairment and functional disability can, it affects between 13 and 15% of people. This is self-reported data from the CDC. So, a lot of our data visualization interaction paradigms use a mouse, like you're hovering on things, you're clicking, right? We're very mouse-driven people in analytical spaces, but a lot of people who have motor impairments or functional disabilities use assistive technology like switches or keyboard interfaces to interact with things, and almost everything from a technical perspective uses what's called the keyboard API or the keyboard interface. So we need to make sure that our mouse-driven interactives are also keyboard accessible. This is a hugely important access issue. Also, cognitive and attention impairment. This includes ADHD, autism, a wide range of other, intellectual developmental disabilities, a wide range of other things. Affects between 11 and 13% of all people. And, we really have almost no guidance on how to we have this huge potential, right, in interactive systems, interactive technical systems, to scale or let users set their preference. How much explanation do you want? How much clarity do you want in text? How much text do you want? And I think that there's a huge potential for our field to kind of explore how can we, convert complex language into plain language. What can we do to make more accessible data experiences for these folks? And deep in my talk, I just want to revisit data visualization. Now that you've kind of seen me throw data visualization, data experiences, I haven't actually said data representations yet, but sometimes at this point in the talk, I've mentioned it. But I'm talking about data visualizations because this is the field that I've worked in for a long time. And I'm really equipped, I think, to engage a lot of the issues in this space, not just from an accessibility standpoint, right? Like, I'm a data viz practitioner, so I can, refer to myself. So data visualization, sometimes abbreviated data viz with a Z or data viz with an S, is presenting data in a structured symbolic way. And the structure and semantics of these things we create actually go far beyond the visual. And so I prefer to call these data experiences or representations because that's a little more inclusive. When we're trying to do inclusive work, right, we should use inclusive language. And talking about experiences or representations is a little more of an accurate way to talk about the work we're really doing under the hood to make something, say, screen reader accessible. Well, a person with a screen reader may or may not even see the chart, but they're going to be perceiving the underlying structure of it as they interact with it. And that different type of perception is, we need to be able to talk about it more than just with the word visualization. I love this demo. Sarah is a very good friend of mine, somebody who I respect greatly. They recorded themselves. They audited a bunch of election graphics, it's important data, right? We need to make sure that data about our elections, especially if more and more we've been representing them in charts and graphs, we need to make sure that they're accessible. So this is, just one of many experiences that Sarah captured of what it's like for somebody who uses a screen reader on their mobile device to interact with a map, an election map.
Image. 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 One face. Image. Logo other. Image. Image.
I'm going to pause it here. So we just, Sarah is just swiping, and the keyboard focus, which is this kind of white outline around each state, is moving between states, which is fascinating. Somebody did the work of making keyboard or non-mouse driven access work. That technicality, that functionality is there under the hood. But what's missing, quite importantly, is all the data about what each state, who did Biden or Trump win the state? Is it a win? Is it a lead? Is it a flip? What's the status? And what's even the state? What state are we currently on as we navigate? So really important. Data itself, I always say this, data is really painful, but visualization shouldn't be, right? The whole point of visualization is kind of, it performs this other task. And why am I talking about data visualization and not like just broadly data stuff like notebooks? Well, I already sort of spoiled it. It's like my specialty, my field, but also this is where I like to reframe how we think about visualization. Visualization is actually already an assistive technology. When we take data, something that's hard to understand, and we turn it into a representation or experience that's easier to understand, that is an assistive act, right? And we are already building assistive technology. So my challenge then is to everybody, why do we stop there? I think data visualization is a really hopeful starting point because we're already kind of trying to break down cognitive barriers. And then my main question is just why not stop? Why not keep going? Why not continue to do what we're already doing and try and make stuff that's really difficult not quite as difficult? And ultimately, access is about breaking down barriers, and assistive technology is an attempt to overcome barriers using technology. So I want us to continue this work. And when I frame things with data representation and data experience, I'm talking about, because we're using this new inclusive language, we're going to be talking about like functional parts of a visualization, like how does it work when you interact with it in different ways? Semantically, what does it mean? What are we talking about? What's a bar on a bar chart? And how do points on scatter plots relate to each other? Are there outliers? We're also talking structurally, like how have we prepared this data to be navigated or experienced? Is it tabular? Is it non-tabular? Is it nested or hierarchical? And then also when we're thinking about interactivity, both kinds of interactivity, right? Like, interacting using a keyboard to navigate, interacting by selecting something, but also interactive experiences like you get in a notebook where you put in code, you get some kind of output. That's an interactive experience, right? That's a loop. And so when we talk about data representation and data experiences, we're actually encompassing like the whole picture of what it means to interact with data. And so here's a question I have for everybody, which is, and we'll spend a couple minutes on this. Please put your answers in chat. Try and have somebody in mind who asks you this question. Not me, but somebody, right? Somebody you really want to convince. And they say, how can we make open source data work more accessible? Maybe there's somebody really important or somebody with a lot of power or somebody who's funding something. You have like 1 to 2 sentences to like just say like, here's my answer. Here's what we can do. Throw it in chat. I really just want to see what everybody's ideas are. And maybe some of you will have good ideas that, these are things we actually should say. So I got the comments screen open. Please drop your answer in chat. Oh, there are a couple up in the thread. Oh yeah, because I asked it earlier just as a test of the chat system. Thank you. Established channel for feedback. Really good. Cameron also said something. Yeah. Great. Yeah, so I'm just going to speak these out loud while folks still try and add their own input. Okay, so starting all the way back, Annette said, first thought, establish channels for feedback from folks with disabilities. As they say, nothing about us without us. I love that. Cameron, I'm newer to data work, but perhaps even some simple things like making sure there's good documentation and visualizations are accessible as a start. Yes, love that. Let's see. Make it part of a standard review process. That was Isabella posting as Tanya. Then Cameron said, make sure that the tools we use to do data work are accessible. And that said, figure out how to enable sonification. Peyton, educate the broader community. Yin, more training on how to make data work accessible. R, Eli said, include accessibility best practices in tutorial instructions. Gabriel, hire people. Yeah, but maybe in tension with open source. Yes, that is a huge tension in open source. Thinking about the practice known as dog fooding. Oh, I don't know what that is. Might, when we get to open discussion at the end, it might be great to hear more about that. Rose, create a system of questions or considerations to iterate through. That's good. Mars, agree on making accessibility part of review. Yeah, a part of the cultural expectation. I like that that's been said twice now. Yes. Okay, Tanya, sort of a chicken and egg, but also making sure our communities are more inclusive. Oh yeah, that is the big chicken and egg problem in communities. It's like there was a community organizing meeting that I went to where they were trying to, like, they had identified members of the community who had mobility disabilities, and the building that everybody was meeting in was not accessible. There was no ramp. Rose, more specific, improve command line terminal interfaces. Ooh, interesting. I'm really interested. I think maybe that could be an interesting discussion later. Most folks I know who are blind or low vision and use a screen reader actually prefer command line interfaces to every other kind of graphical user interface or anything else, because to them it's just pure text. But I'd love to normalize no mouse days. Yes. I love using no mouse. Yes. Okay, cool. That's plenty. That's a lot. I hope you all keep this conversation going. And I think we had some really good answers in here. I was wondering if anybody would try and be super ambitious and big. And some of these are big, but I would actually say you all did a good job of keeping these winnable. These are things you could really do. And now I'm going to kind of dig into, I have a background in community organizing, and I have some advice that I want to give to y'all. So here's like 10 strategies. I'm going to talk a little more about the first 4, and then I'll just let you have that kind of structural advice for your own stewing. But let's break into the things that you as an individual can do. 4 things that I think are really good to keep in mind on the quest for accessibility. I just want to preface that not all action is solved by individuals alone, and in fact, very little is, especially if we're really thinking about how connected we are to our work and our environment. So much of what we do is dependent and interactive with others, especially in open source work. So always, always, always keep in mind the structural picture of things that are happening beyond just you as a person. And the first thing I want to say is, learn how to evaluate. I've been in this space for a very long time. Check out Chartability if you haven't. Check out WCAG, which is Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. Just kind of learn, don't reinvent the wheel. And you certainly don't want to invite people with disabilities to kind of help you in your quest if you haven't done what I consider to be the bare minimum, which is evaluate your own systems and try and meet a decent standard of access according to those standards. That's step 1. This is by itself quite a long quest. So, but get started. And I'd love feedback on Chartability too, as y'all interact with it. More and more folks using it would be really helpful because it's an open source project too. So this next one is huge. And in open source, the tension is you're trying to do everything for free. And often people with disabilities are asked to do work for free too much because everybody wants them. So one of the best pieces of advice that I have is obviously invite people to join you, but also just find where they're already talking about stuff. Like Liz Hare, I love Liz. Liz is amazing, really outspoken, has a lot of interesting things to say on Twitter, really outspoken in the R community. And so find where they're already speaking, right? That's a way to help them avoid doing redundant work. They're already doing the work of trying to educate people. So go to wherever they're at and just join their communities. It doesn't have to be Twitter. There are lots of places you could go. Another thing that I want to say is pace yourself. Work on just a single new thing at a time. I have done this, and honestly, I think it's the only way I've survived certain periods of my life on the quest towards anything, but especially accessibility. So right now I'm digging into touch and keyboard interaction paradigms, thinking about how we structure data to like make those interaction paradigms like really seamless and powerful and empowering. And that's just where I'm at right now, digging into these issues. So like even me, I'm always working on just one thing at a time. And if you overwhelm yourself with trying to solve all of accessibility at once, that's not sustainable for an open source community, right? The advantage of open source is that if you're going to do one thing, you're going to really hope that somebody else is going to be doing their thing too. And if we all do that, there might be a chance to really engage something at scale with a bunch of broad and difficult problems. And then this is really from my community organizing background, which is break issues into smaller manageable parts. I found an audit online of I think a student did of something in Jupyter, and it's great. It's like a full WCAG audit, but there's a lot in there. And I would say that if you ever end up in a situation like this, try and break anything into the smallest pieces you can so that you can get small wins quickly. That is so important in open source and especially volunteer communities, because people will burn out otherwise. And you know, I think that broadly the organizing community has a lot that could teach us about open source work that we really, you know, most open source communities don't pay attention to, but especially with something important and related to justice like access. You know, Jupyter has a chance to negotiate access in a way that like Plotly couldn't, right? Y'all are the platform that most people come together on to do their work. And say, for example, you just had, you know, a really simple requirement that, you know, libraries need to be able to you need to be able to provide a way for users to add alt text to all of your charts and graphs. That's not a problem we want to solve. You need to be able to do it, and here's when we need it by or something. I don't know if that's actually winnable, but it's an example of like one small thing that you can do as a community with your power. So yeah, and then there's structural strategies. Maybe just take a screenshot of this, save it, stew on it later. I'm not going to like kind of walk through all of this. The first 5 are like really common to like strategies for implementing accessibility in organizations. And I added number 6 because it's important for volunteer and like open source work, which is celebrate your wins, like very intentionally. So like, I hope that by the end of today, everybody except the people who organized, all of you, it's your job to put together an event where you thank the people who have done all the work until now. Like, please, please, please celebrate them. Like learn their names, send them emails, thank them for what they've done. That is hugely important because burnout is real and it is so stressful, anxiety inducing. The pressure is real in this work, and people who are doing the work, you know, celebrate them and celebrate yourself too for what you've done. So I think, let's see, for the sake of time, I'm going to maybe like just briefly talk about evaluation because I think it's step 1. It's what everybody should learn. And then we'll just open things up for discussion with the time we have left. So learning how to evaluate is something that anyone can do. You can be a designer, you can be an engineer, you can be an analyst, an auditor. Obviously auditors audit, right? But even managers, everybody should have like an instinct. And you get instincts like that looks like it's low contrast. You get an instinct like that when you just have a set of standards that you regularly rely on and you know, right? So you got to build that system, or you got to build that knowledge and experience in order to be able to just have an instinct. I can look at something now and say, that looks low contrast. Let's check it. And looking to standards is the best first step because standards are going to be consistent, right? Standards change very slowly. So it's a good step 1 for evaluating. I always talk about how, you know, thousands of years ago, people used still wood fasteners or like screws by hand, and none of them were interchangeable. They would break down easily. It takes forever to build. And data visualization is like that. It takes a long time to build. A lot of stuff what we do from scratch. It feels pretty flimsy. But when you look to standards, like the Phillips screw standard revolutionized fasteners as an industry, and it enabled us to have automobiles and a whole bunch of other things, right? You can go to a hardware store and get a Phillips screw and you expect it to work pretty well. And I want that for data visualization, at least at a low level, and especially for things like accessibility. I want an accessible, interchangeable experience across environments across the world. And in order to get there, we all have to get on the same page with how we're evaluating things. So look at WCAG. If somebody hasn't dropped the homepage in chat, the link for just web content accessibility guidelines, that'd be great. Just drop it in. It informs policy by governments that represent like more than half of the world's population. So it's anticipated to be adopted into policy by 2025 by I think 90% of the world's population. So like, yeah, at least get on the same page with WCAG. And then there's tons of research that shows that WCAG does not go far enough, right? And talk to anybody who's interacted with a compliant system who's disabled. They'll have feedback still, right? So after you do your due diligence, this is the last note I really want to end on, which is please involve people with disabilities. And yes, you should probably pay them. I know that's in tension with open source, but you have to incentivize things, even in an open source community, and try and make it fair. So I have some advice on making your collaborators' lives easier that I'm just going to breeze through. Number one, invite them to discussions. Number two, find where they're at and join them. That's powerful, by the way. Not very many people do that. Three, try and write up issues on your repo with them or for them. Don't always just expect like people to come to you with problems. Like be proactive. Empower them to help drive design decisions that affect them. So if you're like, ooh, we have this tough issue with low vision, do you want to help us? That's powerful if they get to be a co-designer, right? And then if you're going to pay anybody in the whole process of open source, I like to just argue you pay people with disabilities because their expertise is very rare, it's very in demand, and from a justice perspective, they're often, far too often asked to do things for free. I am asked to do things for free all the time, and my disabilities, I navigate through life, so I'm always thankful when people compensate me for work or for speaking or for anything. I'm hugely grateful for that. But everybody's going to have a different level of commitment and experience and expectation. And starting with, a standard rate that you hope to pay people before you talk to them and offer that upfront is the best way to do it, so that you don't expect them to ask you. And then the last advice I have is try to use what already exists, both to integrate into your own work, but also just as inspiration. The number one place I always point to is high charts. I love them. Oystein is a good friend, and his work with Ted at Elsevier, they have created what I think is one of the most impressive and accessible libraries out there for doing data visualization. And you can just go to their accessibility page and just dig into the richness that they have to offer. So that's it. I forgot to send slides. So I think I emailed Isabella right before my talk started, and hopefully we can get the slides to everybody. I don't know how we put up stuff, but yeah, it'd be great if you could all get the slides so you could get the resources and stuff. And that's it. Thanks.
Frank, that was incredible. Thank you so much. It really reinforces how important the advocacy work is. Like, you definitely left with things that organizations can take and really empower accessibility. Thank you so much. Right now, let's take some questions. I hope you all have been hanging out, getting ready for this time. If you want to throw your questions into the chat, praise and kind words will also find their way there that we can share. But yeah, Isabella, I'm curious, while we're waiting for questions to roll in, are there any questions that came to mind to you while you were watching Frank's talk?
I mean, yes, but I'm trying to filter what's useful. I know one that you brought up kind of at the end was about specifications, right? Which is something that's on my mind a lot because, especially with IAM, since I'm not really a code contributor to open source projects, I'm not the main one. What am I going to say? I'm not going to be the main one writing the guts of the things. And so it really matters to me trying to set up something so that people can figure out what they need to do, right? And that's how I see specifications too. So with that, I guess I would want to ask, like, how do you prioritize that, right? You have Chartability kind of has a specification going on. How do you sort those things? How do you prioritize things?
Yeah, good question. So 18F is a government agency, and they actually have like this super rad like list of like accessibility priorities. So if you want to like offload prioritization to somebody else, like look at how they prioritize. The reason I say this is because when you make a decision about priorities, especially in the accessibility space, it's difficult to be fair and know what's fair. And I point to 18F because they're a government agency. A lot of decision making went into their own list of priorities. So for like specifically web content, they have like a great breakdown. I would alt-tab and go find it, but maybe somebody can Google it and drop it in chat. But also another thing that you should keep in tension with like a priorities list that's like top down is always allow the community to disrupt your priorities. If somebody comes to you and they're like, hey, I need this thing, and I'm like doing this thing, honestly, like if you have like an open source community in place that can support feedback like that, and you have bandwidth to flex, like help people as they come to you, because that's powerful. And there's going to be traction anytime a person comes to you with an issue that it's going to be hard to generate. It's hard to generate traction from your own list of priorities. It's very easy to generate traction when somebody comes to you and is like, hey, I need this thing. So yeah, that's kind of my advice on that.
That's a good summary.
That was awesome. It looks like we do have some questions or comments. Mars jumped in saying that she found out about free pick through this talk. So she's going to use those stylish vectors to people. But I'm also going to share a post that Mars wrote for Quansight Labs about making NumPy accessible. She's been doing tons of work on NumPy's documentation, making things accessible. And she wrote a really rad blog post as to why. So that's shared in the chat right now. And then let's see. We got this link to 18F shared. I wasn't aware of that. Thank you for bringing that up. Ely ran an awesome community accessibility workshop last year. She said she's going to be using the argument that data representation and visualization is already a form of accessibility, which I kind of love.
Oh, credit. I'm going to type in chat. The very first person who coined that is a super good friend of mine. Probably, I don't know. I don't want to be corny, but maybe my best friend in this space. His name is Doug Sheppers. He used to work at W3C. He's been in web standards for years. He's a data visualization guy. He cares a lot about this stuff. I don't know if he'll say this out loud, but he's one of the reasons we have SVG on the web as a standard. So I love Doug. He's the first one who I ever heard say that statement. And like I have workshopped it a little bit into my own, like how I like to phrase it. But yeah, he's the inspiration for that. I love Doug.
That's great. Frank, you want to take to have a look at Annette's comment here? I don't know if you want to add any color to this about data spatialization.
Yeah. Yep. So I have a blind friend who refers to data viz as data spatialization because the spatial component is what he sees as distinguishing it. I wonder what is the difference between spatialization and experiences, which is broader and making me think. Yeah, super good question. I come from the visualization community. When we talk about a spatial visualization, to me, that is actually different than something that might be an abstract or geometric only kind of representation. Like a bar chart we wouldn't say it's spatial because the bars don't represent real space. They represent abstract space. And so it's a symbolic representation of something that's not like out there in the world. But a spatial visualization would be like a map where the pixels or the things you see on an X and Y coordinate represent something real that's out there, or some approximation of the realness. So when we say spatial, that's usually how I refer to it, is that there is there's like a real thing out there. But you know what's interesting that I think is great about a blind friend referring it to it as spatialization is when you work with a tactile interface, it becomes spatial. All abstract visualizations become spatial. They become real things in reality where their X and Y have like a tangible meaning and existence. So I think that that's fascinating. I think that, you know, that's great. When I use experiences, that's my catch-all for the broadest way I could possibly talk about what we do, which is turning data into something. Representation has, like data representation has this assumption that the data is like trying to become something, but an experience is actually like framed for you interacting with the thing, right? And so I prefer to frame it that way. Maybe it's too postmodern of me, but when we come to data and we have some kind of experience, that is the space, it's very human-centered that I like to frame things around, as opposed to data representation, which is sort of framing it around the data, not necessarily the person first.
That was beautiful. Also made me think of tactile maps.
Yep, they're the oldest form of accessible stuff. Perkins School for the Blind has like a great catalog. So if you have a blind friend who wants to go on a pilgrimage to go to Perkins, they can like check out and touch maps that are like 200 something years old.
Oh, that's so neat. That's so neat. Data, I mean, maps are just that they're the pioneering element of data visualization, effectively, right?
I think so. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So we got another comment from Ely. So we've been running these. I mentioned these earlier to you, but we've been running these low code workshops that help bring people into the project, right? We do acknowledge community is important for accessibility. One of the ones that's been great is we can get people to edit RST and Markdown and HTML and add some alt text to the docs. But we've been hard pressed to find some other places where people can come in. So we're curious if you have any other ways that you can think about accessibility being a door into the community.
Yeah, my favorite one to teach people beyond alt text. And by the way, if you want to upgrade your alt text game, look into image descriptions, which is the next level. Alt text is a specific technology we use to provide an image description to something. And alt text is like behind the scenes, right? But an image description more broadly is also visually, you can see the description of the image. And I think that when you look into research by like the Diagram Center, their research showed that providing visually a table you can see as well as a summary is one of the best things you could do for accessibility for cognitive and vision related impairments. So yeah, if you want to like go next level with just alt text, go to image descriptions, which is like kind of broader, impacts more people. But if you want something different to mix things up, teach people how to analyze contrast. So you get a little dropper tool, you drop her on a color, you drop her on the color that surrounds it, you get a little contrast ratio, like a rating between the two. And that's a great way to give people that kind of instinct that when they look at something, they're like, ooh, that looks low contrast. Can we bump that up? Because we just need more people aware of that, because that I argue that's number two as far as broad impact behind textual descriptions.
One of the points I really loved when you were talking was, learn how to audit your own stuff, right? So last year during the event that Illy ran, we had breakout sessions where we installed Wave, and we had conversations around learning how to use Wave. Yeah. And, it was a really nice way from like almost a top-down experience there. We wound up talking about color contrast and navigability, but it's kind of a really good like splash into getting started. So I'm going to just share that Wave extension on there. I don't know if you have any feelings plus or minus on Wave. But it's something we've been advocating for. Yeah, there's
my old laptop actually crashed just earlier this week. So I'm using a new laptop where I'd pull up my extension. It's, I forget the name of it, HTML something. So Wave catches most things. It's pretty good. I consider it the middle ground. of automated tools for the web. What I think is the absolute best is a little behind the scenes, so it's not as approachable for everybody, but it's Axe DevTools. Axe DevTools, it runs in, like, you go to developer tools and it'll be a tab there once you install it. Without a doubt, the best. Like, their approach rules. It's very good. It's super comprehensive. So that's at one end of the spectrum. But on the easy end of the spectrum, and it's something that catches things that Wave doesn't sometimes, is I think it's HTML code checker. I don't know. It's old. It's really old, but it's good. And it also has some HTML standards that Wave isn't necessarily looking for. And it also does a little better on SVG. So I wish I could remember it. Sorry. But yeah, Axe is my short answer, I guess.
Nice. Thank you.
Yeah, definitely agree with Axe. I was going to say, I mentioned earlier, we were looking into testing stuff, and that has been one of the main things we've been trying to figure out, how to basically put all the things together. Yeah. There's a lot of good resources. It's figuring out how they're going to play nice with some of the Jupyter stuff.
Well, and it's so nice that DQ Labs is open source and they have their consulting service too, right? So, it hits that sweet spot of what we're all trying to do here. So, teaming up with other communities, amplifying each other's efforts. Like, I see writing tests as a future opportunity, better test tools for accessibility as a community opportunity.
We need that badly, right? Like the number one thing. So we interviewed a lot of people with Chartability, and like pretty much every single accessibility expert who we interviewed with Chartability about Chartability, who tried it out, said, okay, these rule, and like half of these could be automated. Like, we need somebody to build that stuff. And so, yeah, like even just Chartability, like we could use, like, there's a bunch of things that you could measure, and we aren't yet. As a note about automated tooling, for those that don't know, DQ actually did like an aggregate study of all of their audits. It's just like some enormous amount of data. And they found that in general, automated testing, even the best stuff, which is theirs, finds about 2/3 of errors according to standards, right? So it's about 67% of all possible things they found using automated testing. And to take one thing, like imagine a stacked bar chart or like a tree map. You've got a little subset. Okay, here's the things automated testing can confidently find. That's a smaller set of all the things that exist in standards. And standards is a smaller set of all possible accessibility problems, right? So somebody did a study of just with blind people back in like 2011, Chris Power, and found, I think that WCAG addresses about 60% of the needs of people who use screen readers. And that's just screen reader use, right? So think of like automated testing as just a little tool in your belt that's super helpful. It saves you bajillions of hours of time, but also definitely not the end game.
Right.
This has been such a contention with our work, right? Because we've been going to a lot of accessibility meetings and they're like manual testing, and it's like we know, but like we're an open source project and we're already getting some regressions by not having automated testing, right? So for us, like the automated testing is also a community contract that helps us ensure that accessibility stays there. Gabriel had a go ahead, Isabella. Yeah,
I was gonna say, I think the process is a different expectation. I think that they're totally right about accuracy, but we can't actually guarantee who or when or what is going to be reviewed or how they're going to review it on an open source project has been the problem. So yeah, that's where I also agree with Tony that I really think we need some degree of automation just to catch at all. But it is very tricky because I worry about where that puts us at the same time, right?
Yeah, one of the nice things about automation in open source communities is if you run a report and you get, 200 errors, some of them may be opportunities for new contributors who are ready to go the next level and actually like dig into code and fix some semantics or something. Because it's not like a lot of errors are at the rendered HTML end. They're not like under the hood. You've got some logic issue sometimes, but that's like super approachable, code light. I definitely see a really important role for automated testing to play in open source.
So this brings another challenge that we're seeing with Jupyter, which is like a lot of these guidelines they're not for data visualization, right?
Yeah.
They're not for web applications, right? And we don't have a normal website, so sometimes we feel like we're in uncharted territory. Yes, WCAG does continue to grow. Hey, we get new color contrast rules in a couple years, right?
Hopefully.
But yeah, in the short term, we might actually even have to start going through, maybe even working a little bit closer with Chartability and thinking about this data experience, right? Because
Oh yeah.
it really be like, if you're generating data, right? Like if you walk into Jupyter and you're like, I'm going to plot something, it's a data experience that you haven't made yet, right? And now you have to figure out that whole path and journey to get there. And yeah, it's an interesting challenge.
Let alone, can you get in the notebook in the first place? Like, I
Oh,
mean,
yeah.
you assumed that was possible, Tony. That's not always the case.
I definitely found when I dug under the hood, one of the first things I looked at was like, I think it was like selecting Python or Python 3. There was like a row of square looking buttons, and they are divs. They are not buttons.
Yeah.
And they have like a tab index on them. And I'm like, well, that's an opportunity. Just change that to a button. You're already more accessible. But yeah, there's lots of little opportunities everywhere.
Oh yeah, but wait till you hear about the hidden keyboard manager underneath of the whole application.
I don't think we have. I don't know if that's a good use.
Anyway,
Yeah.
no, there are some small wins.
Yeah.
And one of the things that you mentioned was making the problem smaller. The cool thing about Jupyter is that it's evolved into this pluggable ecosystem. Everything's an extension, right? So now we're able to focus on a more pared down version of the newest Jupyter, which is just the notebook experience, right?
Yeah.
You actually take the same components that we're building in Jupyter Lab, improve Jupyter Lab's accessibility and a simpler experience at the same time. So we're starting to run into like these super modular components, and they're already internationalized, right? So we have multiple languages and coverage of multiple languages. So now we have to go and do multilingual alt text, and we have to start making sure that this experience is inclusive across nationalities too.
Yeah, I wanted to say that on so yeah, that brings up a bunch of thoughts that I have, but also other thoughts. Oh, are we at time, or are we? I want to be respectful of everybody here. Actually, before I keep talking, what were we going till 45?
We're good.
After?
We're good. Let's just let's continue the conversation as long as possible, or as long as or up until like about 10 or so, or up into the hour, and then we'll switch into the breakout rooms, and we'll just spend the rest of the time talking with the audience. Yay!
Okay, cool. So I wanted to say that first off, I love that both you, Tony, and Gabriel have used the phrase uncharted territory, because it's very corny and I love it so much, because that's where we're at, right? Like when you get into accessible data experiences, it's like it's uncharted space, right? In both senses of the word. And on the note about WCAG, and I really, really, really hope to frame standards in the right way to folks, because for me, this was difficult as a way of thinking about what standards are for. I didn't really realize it at first, but standards are a political document. Standards, and that shapes how we should approach them, right? Standards are developed. They are developed and adopted with like political bodies influencing them, right? So like the only reason standards got adopted is because I think there was early negotiations. I think Japan really did a lot of pushback against the US, and then there were some European players involved. And so standards are a body of consensus before they are an effective way of building accessibility, right? Like the number one thing you need to keep in mind is that standards will never be fully sufficient for creating accessible stuff. It is simply a very good starting point to bring people together for like talking about the same thing, because otherwise it's just this nightmarish mess of like, we don't know how to measure things together and whatever. So as long as you keep that in mind about standards, that it's a political document built on consensus, that the real quest for accessibility is actually far beyond that, then you're good. And I also like to preface, like, following standards or meeting compliance is an exercise in avoiding getting sued. It's not an exercise in providing a good accessible experience. It's just one step along the way, right? It's just like trying to mitigate your risk of like, getting sued. That's really the goal it serves. And if you really want to do a good job of like actually making an inclusive community, then yeah, you're going to have to go beyond standards. And I think that something that is woefully under-discussed, that is perhaps, from my perspective, the most hopeful thing about Jupyter, is what has already been mentioned, which is that it's within a modular ecosystem. And back in the day, 12 years ago now, some really great papers started to come out at the intersection of disability studies and assistive technology, where people started to talk about what does it mean to build communities where people can self-advocate, or where people can have the power to DIY their own accessibility. In real life, people who are disabled, we will often modularize our own house, especially if we have mobility or like, a physical disability. We improve the world around us, but our technical systems are really surprisingly inflexible, which they shouldn't be, right? It actually should be the opposite. Digital and virtual environments should be extremely malleable to the user's needs. And we are seeing, I like to believe, the beginning of this new era of a time when people can, and we see this in notebooks, right? You pick how you want to visualize, you pick how you want to munge your data, how you want to clean your data, how you want to get it from some wild server into your notebook. Like all of that stuff is a choose your own adventure type of experience. And this is the most interesting space for accessibility to arise. And it is more important, in my opinion, to get out of people's way and to break down your barriers in how you allow a modular community to do its thing than it is about trying to actually solve like making everything high contrast. What you really should aspire to do is how can we enable people to build the coolest possible shit that they can bring in, right? That's interesting. And yeah, I'm just really hopeful for that. Sorry, I ranted for like 5 minutes on this, but it's very exciting to me.
Don't apologize.
Oh, that was great. I mean, like in a lot of ways, accessibility is one of the last things to fall in line with Jupyter. It's a project built on open standards and open protocols, right? And we've been adding and adding standards and protocols to the ecosystem for a really long time. And accessibility is one of the last ones, and
Yep.
For me, I personally identify, like, I love telling stories with Jupyter notebooks. Like, I implicitly have communication challenges as a neurodiverse person. But Jupyter notebooks to me often appear as a cognitive accessibility tool. Like implicitly, I see the notebook as an accessibility tool for telling stories that I wouldn't have been able to communicate otherwise. And yeah, it's fantastic for me for those reasons.
Mars had something interesting to say. Can I jump on this? Okay.
Please, please.
Okay. How do you advocate for a cultural shift to accessibility in a decentralized space such as open source? Yes, this is a very good question. For example, needing approval from some other, for a grant to hire people with disabilities. I feel like there's still some cultural resistance that technology is neutral, or against, sorry, chat moved, or against, sorry, I lost my space in my brain. Or against bringing cultural war. Yeah, centralized spaces such as companies or governments can implement top-down policies. The decentralized spaces by nature can't do that. And this is exactly why I'm glad you asked, because now I could just say it straight. This is why I brought in community organizing as just a little hint that I gave earlier in my talk. You all should, I don't want to add to the pressure. You're all going to be learning a lot of new things and doing new things, but your job is to become organizers. In a decentralized space, how do you get a community together to fight a slumlord? You organize. And you can't rely on the police. You can't rely on the mayor, whatever. They might be helpful. Centralized systems are still helpful when you're in a decentralized, like, micro ecosystem, right? You can partner with these big things, and sometimes they can do things for you, muscle things around. But when you're on the ground and you're working in a pretty flat space, organize. And yeah, organizers have a long and rich history of like doing some pretty cool things that I think open source communities can learn from. Because for example, one of the things you can do is, there's cultural resistance that technology is neutral. In organizing, you generally will try to avoid philosophical debates, right? You'll bring people together on like, I care about this, you care about this, right? Okay, good. Now that we agree, let's do it. And the debate is, whether intentionally or not, it's one of the things that really slows down action. And being really action-oriented in a decentralized system is important. And there's a space for philosophy, and there's a space for deeper discussion, and it needs to happen. But it needs to happen in what you might call a caucus or a breakout group of people who you've designated this is a really safe space to kind of figure out what we believe in. And then we go to the larger community with just action. And it takes a lot of work. I burnt out from community organizing years ago. That's why I'm not doing it. It is very tiring. But I learned a lot of lessons from that space. Okay, Mars is continuing. I'm comfortable talking about advocacy, justice, access in humanities spaces. Yeah, I love the humanities. I worked in digital humanities before I got a job in tech. It's my undergrad stuff. I think in some ways decentralized is also a benefit. Over-centralized in terms of changing things. Centralization, yeah, lots of bureaucracy. You got to be lucky. I was lucky at Visa. Just top down. Nobody fought me. I was like, let's do this. They're like, okay, it's part of the mission. Sure, stamp, 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 go. That's very rare, right? Once centralized groups reach critical mass, it can be easier to push forward. Yeah, that's exactly what happened. Yeah. Okay, larger discussion on this. We have 3 minutes. Anybody else have comments or anything?
I do think Rose's comment is interesting because spending all my time in a decentralized space does not feel like it is faster action-oriented, although I see why it could seem that way, but go ahead.
Yeah, so sometimes the open source feels like a parade, and I'm on the side of it, right? Where it's like there are only certain people who can float some of these things, So yeah, it really is I mean, it's not even just like a decentralized system. Like in Jupyter, we're starting to see large organizations gather around the project too. So it's almost like a decentralized and pseudo-centralized philosophies interfering, right? I mean, after hearing you talk, dude, I just want to go start a coup somewhere. I don't even know where, but like, I'm just like ready to go organize something. I don't know. We'll tear down a stop sign somewhere or something.
I'd appreciate it if, I'd love if you turned that energy into people getting some code in on it, to be honest with you.
So the thing that I think entices people about organizing is overthrowing systems of power. But it turns out that that's a very small piece. Largely organizing, you go and knock on someone's door, you check out, you learn your neighbor's name, you learn what they care about, you connect with them, and you're doing almost no work for a very long time. It doesn't feel like work, right? It's a different kind of work. And then eventually when you reach a critical mass of people and you all know they care about the same thing you do, then boom, you can do an action. And if you've strategized correctly, you can do pretty amazing things. So yeah, unionization. Let's go.
I'm really enjoying the turn this has taken. This is not where I expected to go today, but
this
it's
has
very
gotten
good.
very polar.
Best talk I've ever given for sure. I love that it went this way. Yeah.
Mars's picket signs are going to be the best, and I promise you they're going to be the most accessible. Like on her blog post, like people are like, these are the most accessible images. So I can't wait to see how she protests.
That's awesome. Yeah, there's a whole and I'd love to remain part of the discussion too, just to be an ear or a fly on the wall, if you will. But there's a whole unexplored, and by unexplored, I don't mean theoretically. People have talked about this in papers and whatnot, but there are problems when it comes to picketing or advocating in digital spaces, because there actually is a really immovable, inflexible nature by how we've designed. You go to a website, you can't like protest the website in the same way that you could if you stand outside a building and say, stop whatever, right? And so we lose our physical embodied agency in digital spaces. And there's this really interesting thing that happens then in how we organize. Yeah, let's go. Okay, so anyway, I'm reading chat again. Yeah, I just hope to leave you all with a sense of passion that there's tons of things that different people could do if you're interested. You don't have to write code. There's a huge space for just connecting with people. You need to connect and organize and congeal around actions you want to take. And then, if you just want to write code and have somebody tell you what to do and you kind of live in a little like dungeon box, there's roles for those people too. Yeah, everybody has a space. And thanks for having me. This was an enormous amount of fun. Super glad.
That's awesome. Thank you for being here, Frank. That was really informative. And, we're going to have more of these events in the future. We'll let you know about them and maybe, send out some invites to your colleagues and let's start getting a crew together, right? Like organization happens with a massive amount of people. Yeah, it seems like we're all angry in the same direction. So let's keep it going.
Right. And I would also say thank you for, I know Tony said thank you, but really thank you. I hope that you have very rare expertise. And so I was really happy that you were willing to come speak with us, since there's not a lot of people that I've run into at least doing this. So I'm super grateful. And many people in the community have asked for a lot of answers to a lot of questions you discussed today. So I think even people who can't be here will be super happy to have these resources.
Cool. Thank you. Thanks so much.
And I also want to credit your crowd work. You did very good crowd work today, which is hard to do in these digital spaces.
Good.
Yeah. Kudos to you. Kudos to you. All right. Well, Isabella, do we need to share this? So, Frank, we can probably throw you off stage. I don't know if somebody can do that.
Nicely.
Let me get the bucket.
Thank you. Wait, applause. Oh my gosh, Tony. Okay.
So do we need to show our presentation now, Isabella?
Yes, let me get that back up for you and you can talk, if that's okay.
That was so good. I'm so happy we finally got to see that.
I have been waiting anxiously. Okay, sharing entire. It's going to be a moment of awkward and then a moment of here we are.
So we'll be right back.
I had it for me, so I remembered when to stop.
Nice. So, let's see. How many folks are hanging around here? We got 10 folks. Do you think we just do like one breakout room or two breakout rooms?
It depends if you want everyone to talk to each other. I think 10 could be a lot of people to talk over each other. So maybe we should just do 2 so people have lots of opportunity to speak if they want to speak.
Yeah,
you don't have to. Just to be clear, you don't have to speak. You don't have to turn camera on. Whatever it prompts you to do.
Super cool. Can you do a favor and share a notes document in there?
I can when I'm not sharing my screen.
Okay, yeah, good point. Yeah. What was it we're going to talk about?
Oh, that's the next slide. Okay, so we have 2 prompts. And of course, if you have other things you want to discuss, that's open too. But so we wanted to ask, how would you have done past work differently if you already knew whatever you learned today? That kind of introspection, reflection, thinking about those choices can really help you figure out what you want to do in the future. And also just what new questions do you have? What more do you want to learn? I've always found it really helpful identifying what, at least for me, I never stop having more questions. So it's kind of like, what do I want to research next? Because you may be in a room with someone who has an answer to that, and we can already start connecting them together. And just so you know, once I share the notes document, these questions are listed in there as well, so you don't have to just remember them.
We're going to do one breakout room.
Okay.
Frederic had to go.
Okay.
So let's just Tanya, we'll just start one breakout room. And we'll all be here to answer any questions, and we'll share this document in that room, and we'll just have a little discussion. These are your prompts. Feel free to jump in with anything else. And let's just start that session now. All right. Well, we'll have to do the summarization part because we're all in the same room, and thank you all for participating and bringing your experiences to the discussion. We have a feedback form. We'll drop a link in the chat. We'd really love some feedback. There's a new platform for us, and we have 3 more of these events scheduled through March. So we want to continue to improve the experience for everybody. So please fill out the feedback survey. What's after that one? I love these slides. Yeah, so next weekend, we're going to be writing some more image descriptions for documentation. We're going to be running some low-code exercises. We'll have some experts around thinking about some harder problems in the technology stack for Jupyter. So the next week is largely going to be a breakout room, more of a working session. And then in March, we're going to have another pair of events. We'll have another featured speaker. I don't know. I haven't heard anything about that yet. We'll have another featured speaker, and then we'll have another set of breakout rooms and workshops again. So in the meantime, we have Jupyter accessibility meetings every Wednesday. You can find them on the Jupyter community calendar. So that's another place for us to stay involved. If you want to learn more about what the community is doing, if you want to probably see some data visualizations, we've got the Jupyter monthly community call, which is happening, I believe, in 2 weeks. Our accessibility work happens on the Jupyter Discourse and the Jupyter Accessibility Repository. And please join us at a Jupyter Lab biweekly Jupyter Lab accessibility meeting sometime. Yeah, so that's the ongoing community stuff and things you can act on. We'd love to see some of your faces again. Is there another slide? And thank you. Thank you to me, Tony. No, thank you to Isabella and Tanya for doing all of the legwork. This was a long event to get together. We thought there were a lot of important features that we needed to have with it. So thank goodness they're happening now. We have to thank Bloomberg and AWS and NumFocus for the support on these events. We have to thank the Jupyter community building team, Anna and Christine, our sponsors, Bloomberg, NumFocus, AWS. And thanks to the team that wrote the event proposal. This was actually originally going to be run by some folks, and it was accepted before the pandemic. So some of the delay in getting here was thinking about the workshop differently so that we could do it digitally. And last but not least, thanks to Frank for being here, and good luck with your PhD, man. You're doing really great work. It's exciting to read your future research.
Thank you so much.